Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Well, it has been a minute, and happy to have the Roundtable Avengers gathered again here for On the Ledge. And I know many of you have been in the inbox lately with everything that's going on at Queen's Park and certainly in Ottawa and all the spillover there, asking us when we were going to get back to work. Well, as promised, we were back in the chairs now that we are getting set to look at the resumption of activities at the legislature at Queen's Park. And that will happen on Tuesday of next week. So welcome in. I'm Dave Trafford with Keith Leslie, John Wright, and Sabrina Nanji. And this is On the Ledge. And it's all part of now the Story Studio Network. We kind of folded it all into what we're doing and kind of having fun with it. So two things are going to happen here. This is just going to fall into our regular feed for On the Ledge. But I've been doing a daily podcast as well, so we're going to include that in the daily brief feed. So you'll see this popping up once a week in both of these feeds from time to time. So not really quite sure if there's much to talk about today. When last we left, we were. It's hard to believe, Keith, that when we were talking just before we took the Christmas break. What is this Omicron thing? Do we know anything about it really? And people were just starting to test positive. We had no idea what. And now, of course, we're all epidemiologists and can rhyme off everything there is to know about Omicron.
Well, as you recall, in December, we thought, well, this is the end. And then Omicron started coming in. Well, I guess it's not the end of the coronavirus. And boom, the cases of Omicron, just like they did everywhere else around the world ahead of us, rocketed way up and stayed up at astronomical levels. Now, of course, have fallen off a cliff or are starting to fall off a cliff precipitously as was predicted. So this is all unfolding as predicted, but it certainly put another 6 weeks or so into the lockdown mentality and that we can't do anything and riling everybody up again. And speaking of riling everybody up again, we got some very serious protests rolling in. And then, of course, as you say, occupying Ottawa literally for 3 weeks plus, taking over the Ambassador Bridge for 5 to 6 days. I
think it was closer to 7. Yeah.
Was it closer to 7 on that? A full week on that? And boy, that's where Premier Ford was accused of being really slow to act. I mean, he finally declared the Emergency Act, the state of emergency, but why was he so slow, especially on the Ambassador Bridge? The Ottawa thing appears, I think, if we dig into that, I personally think that the Ottawa police chief, the man who resigned, was absolutely to blame for letting those trucks park in front of Parliament Hill in the first place. He was told not to do that. He was advised that's not a thing. He didn't want to interfere with the protests, apparently. He's out of work. The head of the Police Services Board in Ottawa is out of that job. There's a chief that was hired and has quit since then already. It's really a mess for the policing in Ottawa. But I think that situation, as much as Premier Ford perhaps could have acted stronger in Ottawa, it was on the police chief there making the initial mistake. The Ambassador Bridge, I think that one is going to be held to Doug Ford for being slow to react to that. We're told anywhere from, I first heard figures of $300 million a day. Now it's $400 million, maybe $700 million a day in two-way trade across that bridge. And that went on for how long? I mean, that's just ridiculous. So I think in the grand scheme of things, Doug Ford is going to have to answer a lot about the Ambassador Bridge for sure. The Ottawa situation, let's face it, who had Dean French on their bingo card? Coming up to negotiate on behalf of Ottawa Mayor Jim Watson with these truckers. Didn't see that coming. Didn't apparently work worth a darn. So now we've got some serious police action coming in with the Mounties and the OPP and coordinating with the city police and just going in en masse one at a time. And this is over.
Yeah, well,
so that's the good side. That's the upside.
Well, I suppose. I mean, and I want to get to John's numbers in a minute here, but Sabrina, the whole idea that we spent a good week and a half or 2 weeks of premiers pointing fingers at the prime minister, kind of wiping his hands of everything. And it was all of this political, down in the weeds infighting, while all of this was just allowed to blossom and actually take root across the country, not just here in Ontario.
Yeah, and I think thankfully it sounds like it may be the beginning of the end of this, but there's going to be a lot of questions about the response to this. I think Liberal MPP John Fraser, who represents in Ottawa, said it best at committee that jurisdiction has become a 4-letter word. Like, people were fed up with this. There was so much finger pointing. It was like, when are we going to do something? And I think, Keith's right. Like, it took the premier a really long time to do something about it, put his foot down. He was kind of commiserating with the truckers, and I mean, these and their supporters. Like, I get it too. Like, the anger there is palpable. I'm angry too. Like, I'm vaccinated and boosted and, have been following all the rules, but like, I don't even really know why I'm angry, but you can commiserate with them. And the premier wasn't calling these guys yahoos. Like, we heard him call much smaller protests yahoos, but he did kind of call it a siege, an occupation, and eventually put his foot down. I mean, Ambassador Bridge seems like it was the straw that broke the camel's back, because this critical trade link, just choking that off, I think, especially a premier that's supposed to be all about small business, that's the thing that was going to get him to do something. But certainly it allowed the opposition parties to just paint him with this brush of pandering to anti-vaxxers, the anti-lockdown crowd, close to a campaign. And the irony of all of this is that this is happening against the backdrop of Ontario actually opening up. Like, what I'm hearing from my sources is that all restrictions, including the masks, they're going to be gone by the time it's campaign time. The top doctor kind of hinted at that this week, that the last question mark that we have for when restrictions will be lifted are on the masks, and that could happen as soon as early March.
So, John, at what point, I mean, when last we spoke and talked about this and looked forward to the campaign, clearly it would have appeared that the Ford government's handling of the COVID pandemic was going to be, framing any kind of ballot question. These demonstrations and this paralyzation of any kind of political authority in dealing with them, I think that's just sharpened this point. So, hospital beds are not the issue anymore. To what degree is Doug Ford going to wear what's gone on in the last 3 weeks? Even if he clears them all out, the whole idea of this inability to act and show some level of authority.
Well, I think it's going to paint not just Doug Ford, but every politician who has their fingerprints on this. Having said that, it's laid bare the whole issue that you can't direct the police to do what you want them to do when you want them to do it. I mean, that's baked into our institutional process. So, the premier can't, and neither can the prime minister, call the RCMP or anybody else and say, go get those guys. The second thing is it takes time to mobilize. So, it may look easy when you've got a string of trucks and people on a highway to say, just send in these people and pull them out. But they had to mobilize, hundreds and hundreds, up to 1,500 police officers. And then when that was done, they had to put them on buses and trains and planes and ship them to Ottawa, to an outside base, command and control center, where they had to be briefed. And thank goodness, actually, there looks like the police officer now involved, Chris Bell, I think his name is seems to have that purview of an integrated task force to deal with this, which is a very, very highly volatile situation, including, as I understand it this morning, that the Sécurité from Quebec is going to take care of the command and control center, which is just outside of Ottawa in a baseball stadium that the truckers have been using. So these things do take time, but it lays bare to public opinion the whole sense of impotency. And this is, I think, what shocked the country, the sense that no matter who does what, the institutions, the Emergencies Act may be largely camouflage for inactivity, but the reality is it's a sense that the public supports it because it's a sense of getting something done. So whether the premier wears this or not in June is another question. The masks and everything else, I think, are going to be more volatile over the next number of months for a couple of reasons. One is, there's a general sentiment across the country that no matter whether you had a timetable or not, you caved into the trucker. That's in the numbers. Number two, I know the polling showed that there is an appetite to move forward, and there really is. There's an appetite to say, look, we should reduce or get rid of the restrictions with the safety valve of if it affects our healthcare situation, that's the safety valve to bring back those things. Just as an observer, I'm a bit shocked at how quickly in Ontario those things have been relaxed. I thought it would be actually a little more phased in. And I know that the health director, Karen Moore, is talking about, it in terms of a plan. But, I think that Ontario, who's been outside of British Columbia the most cautious with this stuff, we should really, really, really watch ourselves go through this. Just because 65% of the public in Ontario says, I think we should be opening up and dropping those restrictions in, I should be making those decisions based on, my own personal experience, and the Omicron wasn't too bad and blah, blah, blah. We're also, as I said, a province which needs to take things slowly. And if we get hit with Omicron B, which apparently is out there, and there's an impact, I think that's going to have more of an impact on Doug Ford than something in the rearview mirror. Sorry for the metaphor, that may happen, in June when we go to the ballot box.
Why are they saying now that the workplace mandates can be lifted? Because Dr. Moore was asked right away, well, then are you comfortable with a non-vax person who's just waited this out going to work in a long-term care home? Mm-hmm. And he danced, but he didn't give a clear answer other than, well, that's going to be up to the long-term care home now, isn't it? So the people that did want to wait this out, the anti-vaxxers, being told that, the vax passport, Ford didn't want to bring it in. He pushed as far back as he could. It basically was in effect for a month, and it's going to be gone March 1st. I don't see why that needs to be different. Why the workplace mandates need to be lifted so soon? Just because the logic is, well, they've done as much encouraging as they can. It's not about encouraging. It's about those of us that have done the right thing still being able to comfortably go and sit in a restaurant and sit in a game and do whatever else in a large crowd because we know everyone else is vaccinated or passed, brought in there. I don't understand the rush to do this at this point. It seems purely political, and this seems all about the election, which is, just a few months away at this point.
Well, Sabrina, when we look at that, to Keith's point, I heard people talking about that even around the need to show a vaccine passport or certification to go to a restaurant. And I heard people saying, well, whoa. I want to make sure that I'm sitting now 100% in this room. I want to make sure that the people sitting at the table next to me who are less than 6 feet away from me have had all their shots. Doesn't mean I may not get it, but I want to know that they've taken the precaution that I've taken. And I think at some level, and you talked about this off the top, this whole idea that the premier is supposed to be the guy helping out, small business. I don't know that actually helps, because then restaurants, they're left to their own devices. Those who are at all hesitant may not go back to the restaurants. So there's so much confusion in that line. I think that might have been a sort of a tone-deaf step that was unintended.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think that the government had two options, though, with the Vax Pass system. Like, they were either going to ramp it up or roll it back. Like, everyone who's going to get vaccinated, I think with the measures that we've had in place and the restrictions, that probably they already are vaccinated. Like, obviously, we've seen, boosters open up for youth now. But, either they were going to make it stricter, and I didn't think that was likely, with the election looming. So yeah, I think the onus now is kind of on individual businesses, which is putting them in a really tough position. Like even, working at a restaurant, if you're a hostess, going back and forth with someone who maybe doesn't want to show a vaccine pass, their certificate, because it's not necessarily mandatory provincially, but the restaurant still wants to enforce it. Like that does sound like it could get a little dicey, but I think that they really only had two options, and that this was the way they were going to go. Obviously, they have the top doctor's recommendation, and of course, the premier kind of asked him, can you lay this out for us? And so like they are saying that that's what the advice is. And so we've seen kind of even the Liberal Party backtrack and say, we are supporting the lifting of the Vax Pass system because it's the Chief Medical Officer of Health's recommendation. The NDP didn't do that. They're saying that that the Vax Pass system is what is preventing future lockdowns. Like we've kind of had these fits and starts. So I guess we're going to see how it plays out. But the premier isn't completely wrong. wrong when he was saying that, you can still get COVID, especially because of Omicron, even if you're vaccinated. Obviously, it may not hit you as hard if you're vaccinated and boosted. But, because this thing is so widespread, I mean, experts do agree with the fact that, when it comes to transmission, maybe the VaxPass system is losing some of its efficacy here. But you're right, how this is going to roll out, it's going to probably be a bit dicey.
Let me pause at something because we've talked about this before. Over the course of the last 2 years, we have taken what is now 9% of the public, and we have ostracized them, vilified them, barricaded them, passported them. We've done everything that we can, and part of that, by making them aliens, and maybe it was the right thing at the right time, we now have what we have in Ottawa, and we're going to have more of it with that kind of circumstance. So let's be clear that you can't, as I said before on this, you can't take 3.4 million people and squish them in a corner and then keep squishing and not expect a reaction. So part of that is that. The other part is the public's point of view, and that is, if it is what it is and we're going to live with this, we better start living with it. But to Dave's point and to Keith's point as well, the anxiety, when I see these unfolding, my sense of anxiety about going back to the office and not knowing who is sitting beside me or what's in the air because you're not checking passports or the protocols have changed, that's going to take some thinking on the behalf of the business as to how they're going to deal with this, because they've gone from one to the other side very shortly with that. Secondly, with the businesses that are opening to all of this, I mean, it is an adjustment period, but what's also an adjustment period to people like us are also to the people who have been excluded from all of that for the longest time. I mean, think the thought process that goes through there. They've been excluded from our society, and all of a sudden, boom, you're in, everything's okay. So I go to this point of saying it's really difficult to make these decisions. But there is a sentiment among the public that we're going to have to live with this, so we might as well start living with it. And I said before the podcast to Keith, I was in Halifax 2 weeks ago. It's a lot more open there than it is in Ontario. No question about it. I mean, even my son is a university student, was in a boombox kind of nightclub atmosphere on the strip there. Sorry, Halifax has a strip. Of all the pubs, and you don't have it here. It took me about 48 hours to be completely comfortable with everything there. And that's still walking into restaurants with the mask on and taking it off, but it's a lot more open. I agree that we have to be moving on. The only question I have at this stage is, the amount of time that businesses and others can adjust to this, but more importantly, how the public feels about whether this is too fast. And I think that's where it's all going to happen.
Let me get into some of the numbers that you've released this week, John, because I agree. I think generally speaking, we're all going to have to and sort of academically and logically get our head around the idea that this is here, and we, quite frankly, that's what the epidemiologists were telling us 2 years ago. Remember that? This is something that's going to last for about 2 years, and then it will be, in the environment, and we didn't want to hear it. Now we're finally there. Okay, we get it. We're going to live with it. When I looked at your numbers, though, I think that there's something underneath that, and you'll know better than I do, but there's still this sense of tribalism. There's this sense that we've created others, even though we understand that we are in a place where we're going to have to live with it. There is this level of us and them, me and you, hold off. You stay in your corner, I'm going to stay in my corner, and not for health reasons, but because there's an anxiety that's bubbling to the surface. And as I looked at your numbers, it would appear as though that anxiety and angst, I mean, what was the number? Like a third of Canadians said that they would take up, violent action to support their fundamental Canadian rights. That's a huger number than the people that didn't get vaccinated. And that begins to really worry me. Is there an opportunity to sort of quell that? How do we put that cork back in the bottle?
Let me be uncharacteristically short with my answer. It's 12% are deeply committed to the view that if their Canadian values are are dealt with in a closed context way, that they would push back into the point of violence, which is the equivalent of 4 million people. And there's no real difference across the country in terms of province, slightly higher in Quebec and a little bit in Alberta, but it's also, demographically a little younger. I think, Dave, that what we witnessed in Kelowna or in British Columbia in the last 48 hours, with damage being done there by what I would call eco-terrorists, okay, right
to
there.
To the pipeline.
The pipeline and all that.
Yeah.
All the way through to what we're seeing in Ottawa. There's an underlying issue here that I don't think many have recognized, and that is by doing what happened in the last month. And again, this started with, you can't be vaccinated. You have to be vaccinated to go over the border. One wonders whether or not we had just said, okay, you can just go over the border, whether we'd be where we are today. But it's created an ecosystem. It's created a separate ecosystem of funded, organized, chat room-oriented group of people across the country to whom the truck is not just a symbol, but a weapon that can be used for other things in other places. And to your point, I think that that's profoundly going to change our country. It is the lack of action on all of this, but it's also fueled now a group of people who, with, I'm not associating them all with this, but when you find firearms and conspiracies to kill RCMP officers at a bridge or at a crossing, which they have found and arrested people for, that's going to bake into the notion that we do have this other column that in society that we have to watch out for. That did not exist a month ago. So I think the numbers speak to a much more profound change in our perspective of our society, which began with a prime minister. I'm not being political. It began with a prime minister when someone threw gravel at him, who then started in that campaign to take these people and wedge them into the Nazi flying Confederate, miscreant offenders of our society, which continued up until even yesterday and inflames that group of people. So we have a new dynamic in this country. There's no doubt about it, Dave. And I don't know how we're going to see it going forward, but I think it's profound. I really, really do.
Yeah, well, and I think both to Keith and to Sabrina, I mean, you guys kind of watching it from what's going on in the press gallery at Queen's Park, the idea that we are where we are because government ignored, to begin with, that what we were calling fringe voices. We were willing to ignore what was going on with the People's Party of Canada. Sure, they only got 5%, but let's face it, they've just got a whole lot more fuel on their fire thanks to what's going on in Ottawa, and it's a lot more than 5%. At what point do we need to, or will we see, sort of this political pivot to say, okay, we need to stop talking about the big tent and really, broaden our peripheral vision here, Sabrina, and look at how are we going to address what John's talked about on a broader level, so we're not at the same time sympathizing with a fringe, but really kind of getting to a point where there is a deeply rooted issue and concern around here about, basics of governance in this country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, for all the harping on Doug Ford that the opposition were doing about him being MIA and slow to respond and playing both sides, I mean, the Conservatives are supposed to be the party of law and order here. So I think, eventually they had to do something. And for whatever small political capital there might be for, the Ford and the Conservatives to gain here before an election. I mean, we've already kind of seen Conservative MPs, backtrack on some of their initial support for this. Obviously, I think we can all agree that things have gone way too far into occupation. But I think we can't ignore that frustration that's out there. I can feel it myself too. And I don't really agree with a lot of these tactics from the protesters. Obviously from the gallery's perspective, I don't think they're very nice to myself or my my colleagues, being in the media. But, it's that can't really be ignored right now. Like, that frustration is being felt. I think even John would know, and so for Trudeau to dismiss them as a small fringe, kind of those same echoes from the provincial level Liberal leader Stephen Del Duca, like, it was a field day for the Liberals too, like, politically speaking, just to call out the protesters just as much as it might have been a gain for Ford, intentionally or not, to keep quiet on it. So yeah, I mean, politically speaking, it's just kind of been fascinating to watch this all play out in real time, how all these politicians are kind of trying to walk this seemingly impossible line of having their cake and eating it too when it comes to this so-called fringe or not, I guess.
Well, Keith, it's just sort of the suck and blow of response, and I'm not sure that that's sustainable.
Well, it's absolutely ridiculous. And I think if we see things like there's talk of freezing the bank accounts of donors to the convoy, not of the convoy people, but of donors to them, that I think will drive those numbers even higher out of that fringe and into more of a mainstream. This is government overreach. How far are we going to go in trying to deal with this? It should have been dealt with earlier. This is reactionary. To the very beginning of this, when we saw the province go, well, it's in Ottawa, it's a federal problem. Clearly, Doug Ford wanted this to be Justin Trudeau's problem, as did most of the protesters, despite the realities of the laws and the mandates. But it didn't work out that way. I mean, in the end, Trudeau was pointing the fingers. The federal government was saying, well, they're not on the bridge. They're on the provincial roads approaching the bridge. Like, holy cow. It's as if this was a First Nations reserve and the federal and provincial governments were doing their finger pointing back and forth at each other again, except it was the whole world watching. Not even all of Canada. The whole world was watching what was going on in Ottawa at this point. And the inaction, the inability to deal with this, the fact that we see it getting worse and worse, and the bouncy castles and the hot tubs and the candy, holy cow, it just got so far out of control as these two levels of government pointed fingers at each other. I think that is going to, that has to be addressed, and listening to people as opposed to driving them more into that camp. I think one thing that needs to come out of all of this, though, and it could be done by governments all around, is let's clarify what are the rights of Canadian citizens, because there's obviously a lot of confusion about what our basic rights are. They're not the same as the rights of the American citizens, although some of the protesters seem to want to join the two. And what are your rights and the government's rights to do with your rights in a pandemic? Can rights be, what levels of rights should be suspended? But what are our basic constitutional rights and freedoms? I don't think most Canadians are really aware of that. And this protest, this occupation, proved that to a lot of people, I think. So we can start with some basic education, but the tolerance for each other, learning to not only sit side by side, but work side by side, go out side by side with people who we've had some pretty strong arguments with or disagreements. Even the Premier talked about openly about how his family is divided. We've not reported on his daughter's actions, but she was vehemently anti-vax, anti-government mandates. And here's the Premier, he choked up when he talked about this. It's his family. A lot of families are dealing with this. So I think that's where we're going to have to see it come to. The healing is going to have to come in families dealing with each other that had the mandate split, and then broaden it out into workplaces and into going out into social settings. But I think it's going to be a real battle for a while, or a real awkward situation. Maybe not, it'll be more awkward silences perhaps. And we've already had the arguments. So how do we get beyond that? I don't know.
John?
I think it divides into two parts. I think you're right, Keith, that we're going to have to redefine what a protest looks like, or what our rights are to do these sort of things. Unfortunately or fortunately, that's left to the courts. That's where that lies, because you can have whatever parliamentary body you want, but you're dealing with rights which are in the charter and all that sort of stuff. So I agree with you, but I think it's going to take longer to work out. The more important thing, though, is that we have police. Again, I go back to my original point. You can't direct the police to do what they do. And if they decide that they want to dance in the street with protesters and shake their hands and make sure that the hot tub stays there, the politician is standing by and watching all of this take place. What it signals to me is actually now a greater vigilance on behalf of police, who may crack down on even the beginnings of some kind of protest. Like, I can see at some point in Ottawa, those pneumatic blockers that are, built into streets so they go up and block things. I can see, more police with riot gear and maybe a bit more things that would be in European communities. Why? Because they're a paramilitary organization and that's what they do, but also because this has now happened. This is precedent setting. So I think we really have to divide this into two parts. One is the rights of one area, but the other part is we're here where we are because politicians at the end of the day in certain areas of our country have no power whatsoever, and neither does the institution.
All right, we're going to leave it there because we can't wait for what's going to come up next week in question period. So I hope you guys have got your running shoes on because I expect it'll be fun times. Sabrina Nanji, John Wright, and Keith Leslie, thanks for joining us. This is On the Ledge. I'm Dave Trafford. And all part of Story Studio Network. If you want to find out what we're doing, check out the website, storystudionetwork.com. This is produced as an Eye Contact production.